Alrighty, and welcome everyone to today's workshop with Trusting News on how to meaningfully engage with news and journalism and people who may not believe in news and journalism in the way that we would like them to, or the facts that we report. We're going to be joined and led today in this discussion by Lynn Walsh, who is our co-host, an Emmy award-winning journalist who's been working in investigative journalism and national journalism and local journalism in multiple states across the country for some time now. She is also serving on the national board for the Society of Professional Journalists. And she also was the national president for the organization, where she spoke out against threats to the First Amendment and worked to protect and defend journalists and journalism. I give you, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, Lynn Walsh.
Hi, everyone. Good to be here with you. And so I'm coming to you from my current role, where I'm the assistant director at Trusting News. You may have been expecting my colleague, Joy, but she is in Florida and luckily safe and okay, but the storm went right through where she lives. So I'm filling in. So hopefully you're glad to see me and you can follow up with me. I put my email address there. And if there's anything in particular that you wanted to ask Joy, though, as well, I'm glad to forward anything along. So I'm not sure how familiar you are with Trusting News, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by sharing my screen and some facts about trust, what we do at Trusting News, and some tips that we have. And then I'm going to pause there, take questions. So please be thinking of some questions that you might have. And then I also have a lot of newsroom examples that I can share as well. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you are seeing that.
Yep,
okay,
good.
Great. Okay, so at Trusting News, we work to learn more about how people decide what news to trust, and then how we can apply that and help journalists actively earn trust and demonstrate their credibility. We are a project of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the American Press Institute. And so you probably are well aware, but trust in news is low. It hit its lowest mark in 2016. We've rebounded a little bit since then, but it's still not in a good place. More people would say that they distrust news than trust news, according to most of the research that is out there. Just a couple other research points to point out. I think this is really interesting. This comes from Pew. And what this shows is that in general, when you ask a journalist if they think that news organizations are doing a good job at covering the most important stories of the day, reporting the news accurately, serving as a watchdog, giving a voice to the underrepresented, or managing or correcting misinformation, you'll see what this shows is that when you ask journalists that question, they tend to be more likely to say that journalists do a very good or somewhat good job compared to what non-journalists or members of the public think. So in general, we as journalists give ourselves more credit for those kind of what I think, and hopefully you agree, are these core values that we have in journalism. And so with that said, if we think we are doing a good job, really at Trusting News, we want to know how can we get credit for that work, because all of these different questions, if people don't feel that we are doing these things, that can contribute potentially to distrust. This is another data point that I like to share that I think is important to this conversation, and a pretty alarming stat. I think 46% of people surveyed say they think journalists rarely care about people like them. I know as a journalist and as in every newsroom I've worked in, I didn't feel that this was the case with the reporters and the producers and the managers I was working with. And I was actually having a conversation with a former colleague of mine about this. And, you know, this whole sense of journalism as a public service, I think, is something that is strong in a lot of newsrooms I've worked in and a lot of journalists I've worked with. And so how are we making sure to get that message or help the public see that that is what we mean, that we really are there as this public service? And then this last data point here, which is something that was a little surprising when I first saw it, but then the more I thought about it, I was like, maybe it's not that surprising. Basically, the question of the percentage of US adults who have ever spoken with or been interviewed by a local journalist, that percentage is 21%. So as we think about who we are serving, who we are talking to, and if our goal is to serve our whole community and we want to get to know our whole community, if we're only talking to 21% of our community, and that percentage or likelihood of talking to someone, or if someone has talked to a journalist, goes down, the less white they are, the younger they are, the less educated they are, and the less money they make, you kind of realize, wow, we're sort of talking to the same people often, or the same type of person often. And so what does that do to trust? And so something that we know at Trusting News is trust is based on relationships. You think about who you may trust, who you know, and it's probably people that it's probably people you know, it's probably people you've had a relationship for a while with. And we have to look at trust in a similar way. And if we're not talking to people and allowing them to be able to reach us, building that trust is going to be a lot harder. And so I share this data not to kind of set the tone on a negative start, because it's normal to feel frustrated by this. You might also see this and be determined to see what you can do to change perceptions, or maybe you feel like you have been making some inroads in some of this. You might also feel empathetic about just how hard it is to be a news consumer right now. And I think all of these are fair. What we are trying to do at Trusting News is find solutions to how we can improve those numbers all around. How can we encourage journalists to reach more people and talk to more people to then hopefully build that relationship? How can we get more people to feel that journalists are helpful, that journalists can be relied on, that journalists can be trusted? And so we've been learning about trust since 2016. Primarily how we learn about trust is we work with newsrooms. When we work with newsrooms, we basically test what we call trust strategies that are primarily based in how a newsroom can be transparent, talk about who they are, and then also engage and hear from their audience. And so we test these strategies with newsrooms, we learn from them, and then we share what we are learning and what is working more broadly with the industry. Something that we have been focusing on since 2020 is this whole idea of what we are calling pluralism, and how people's identities and experiences shape their relationship to news. And I think this is particularly important as we think of people who distrust news, maybe don't trust facts or don't think we are producing factual information. Some people who tend to be more conservative or lean right. And why we are studying that is because a person's likelihood to trust in news depends on a lot of different things. But when you look at their political leanings, Republicans and people who identify as conservative or Republican tend to have a much, much lower trust in news than Democrats or independents. And so we wanted to kind of focus in and understand more about why that is. And when we started doing this, we realized, that political affiliation may be one thing, but there actually are a lot of commonalities between people who might identify as conservative, but also people who live in rural areas. There are people who are in groups that maybe feel underrepresented or totally not represented in news coverage that have similar feelings. And so how can we better build trust with those populations, whether it's younger generations, it's people of color, it's people who are religious or care a lot about religion? How can we better connect with groups who also tend to have that lower trust in news? And so one thing that we recently did is we did one-on-one interviews. We partnered with newsrooms around the country to do these one-on-one interviews with their news consumers who said that they have low trust in news. And what I'm going to share is some of those talking kind of, I guess, our tips that came out of that. And then I will take some questions from you. And so this is going to be 7 pieces of advice and some other research that we know that kind of backs this up, that we have learned from doing this, specifically focusing in the last 2 years on this audience that has low trust in news. So the first thing we know is that it's really important to show humility. So whether or not we feel like we are a part of the media, we are. Excuse me. And so what I mean by that is that, generally speaking, if you ask someone if they do you trust news or do you trust media? Most likely they are probably going to answer no. And you are being put into that basket. And so we have to know that right off the bat. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that that has to stay that way. The idea is you can differentiate yourself and talk about what makes you different and how you strive to be accurate, fair, and trustworthy. But at the end of the day, when we're talking to groups of people, we have to understand that when they are talking to us, when they are commenting, when they are criticizing our work, that may be where they are coming from. So we should show humility. We also do have to understand that sometimes when people show this anger or this distrust, it's because they may not feel that they are represented in, or that their views are represented in the coverage that they are seeing. And again, they're talking maybe about coverage more broadly, but if you are showing them work that is unbiased or that shows multiple perspectives, you want to be sure to highlight that. The other thing when we talk about show humility is just that it's really hard and complicated to be a news consumer nowadays. There's a lot of information out there. It can be really difficult to know where information came from, if information is news versus opinion. And so that's another reason to show humility, because it can be natural for news consumers to feel frustrated or alienated or totally left out of news coverage. Something else that we're learning is that when we talk to news consumers, particularly those with low trust in news, one thing they point to a lot is these overgeneralizations that news organizations use, whether it's in headlines or it's wanting to always kind of group people into a label or add labels to groups of people. And this is especially problematic for people when we're talking about some of those hot button issues like abortion, guns, even climate change. There are all sorts of different issues like this where we want to sort of group someone as pro-life or pro-choice, when in reality, their views are a lot more complicated. And when we overgeneralize and add these labels, people may feel unrepresented, or you put a headline on that says something like millennials think X or Gen Z thinks Y. Then if I'm a millennial and I see that and I don't feel that way, I don't feel like you understand me. And so then that actually is us adding to polarization and kind of contributing to some of this problem. And so that kind of piggybacks off of the whole idea of how can we highlight moderate voices? A lot of times when we're covering a story, we go to kind of one side or the other, right, of the issue. We don't really allow some of the complicated narratives of how people feel to be shared. And so how can we instead rely on different perspectives, not make it a both sides issues? We do this a lot of times with national coverage, you see this, but you also see this with local issues, this kind of fighting between politicians, right? All of this, it fuels this polarization, not the curiosity. And again, it also leaves most people feeling like their views aren't reflected. And so how can you kind of highlight moderate voices and not overgeneralize and add to this polarization is really looking at the language that you are choosing that to basically describe things, and to that sometimes specifically like adjectives can be really tricky. You might say like in a surprise ruling, or you might say something as simple as in a surprise move, or those kinds of things. Like if you're using those words, one, we would recommend defining why you say that. but also that it could, if someone already has a preconceived belief in something, that's going to show to them that you have a bias towards something, right? So how can we eliminate words, or at least be careful to describe and define why we are using some of these words? And this is just a screen that has, some language that we have found that news consumers pointed out, language with attitude, these labels and generalizations, and then just kind of some other words, just saying something like, a family in Ohio makes just $100,000 a year. Those kinds of words can also add sort of opinions or judgment to that. And so how can we avoid doing that? Another big thing that we talk about and find that can be confusing is how can you rethink wire and opinion coverage? One, a lot of news consumers don't understand that why you run wire coverage, what wire coverage is. And what we found is news consumers at local news outlets are getting basically sort of blamed for polarizing content or fake news, or kind of this distrust based on AP content they may run, or Washington Post content, New York Times content. And so how can you, if you're still running that content, explain the use of the content, but then also make sure to differentiate your content from theirs, why you use the content, and is there a way to not highlight that content on social where people may be more likely to find it? Also, make sure that your labels are just really, really clear on all sorts of opinion content. Try to use the word opinion wherever possible. The word op-eds, the word editorial, people don't always know what those mean. So if you can use the word opinion, please do, and then make sure that that label is traveling when people are sharing it on different platforms. Another big thing that we can do is really listen to the people that you aim to serve. Again, if your goal is to serve your whole community, how often are you talking to people who represent your whole community? And now that doesn't mean you're going to talk to everyone, that's not possible, but are you making sure to reach out to the particular groups that are represented in your communities? We have an interview guide that I can share about conducting regular interviews, but asking them, what are you looking for? What don't you understand? Why do you feel this way? Why are you frustrated by this? So we can kind of better add some explanations, because if we aren't able to answer some of those questions from the beginning, we're not going to be able to get them to trust our other content, or to even maybe get them to consume the content. The other thing that's really, really important is that it's really important to know when to stop trying. So some of you may be listening to this and saying, I've tried to add some explanations. I've tried to explain to people how news works, or how we did this, or why this is a fact, right? And it just isn't working. They continue to maybe add content that's critical. They might not, they keep kind of pushing back with things that just aren't true. And so what we really emphasize a lot is that not everyone is reachable. And unfortunately, while we want to reach everyone, we may not be able to. And so we like to look at it as a spectrum. And instead of paying attention to sort of people on either ends of it, how can we reach more people in the middle? And what we have found through this work in Trusting News is that there are a lot more people in the middle that are willing to have these conversations than I think we realize, because what tends to happen, especially on social media, where we tend to hear from a lot of people that might have these negative beliefs, or that are critiquing our work, or not believing in facts, is they tend to have a very loud voice. And so some people just are not going to believe your facts no matter what you say. They might not believe your integrity, and they might even just see your coverage of social justice issues as politically motivated. And so you as a newsroom have to know that it's okay to stop trying, and you should have a policy in place for deleting content from them, blocking them from conversations, and reinforcing that whenever possible. Because at the end of the day, we are there with especially with spaces on social media, and in our comment sections, we're there. I think our goal, I hope it is to create a space for constructive conversation. And if you have people that just are constantly bringing in misinformation, disinformation, or saying things that aren't true, we really do believe at Trusting News it's okay to delete that content and to block them potentially from participating. But in order to do that, it is good to make sure you have a comment policy and that you've been clear that you will do that before you actually do it, so that you can be consistent with how you approach that. And just a couple other notable insights, and then I have a couple examples, and then I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are any questions. We also know that people think news is biased in some way. Most people do think that. A lot of people also think that news is underfunded, and also in some cases incompetent. People also do believe that journalists are a cause of polarization. And the most important thing here is that most people also believe that journalists have a role in decreasing polarization. And so some of the stuff that I just went over, we believe can decrease that polarization, bring us to a space to have conversations, to live in a world where we can have a shared set of facts, right, that people believe in, so we can move forward and make decisions. People often say that they want just the facts. This is interesting because this is something people say often, but there is definitely a contradiction in what they mean, depending on if someone identifies as more liberal or conservative, or if they are white, a person of color. All of this is coming from a perspective, right? And so when people say they want just the facts, generally, they want facts that support what they know or are part of kind of in line with their beliefs. And they are more likely to question content that is not in line with their beliefs and not something that they have maybe thought of before. So if you are producing content that is just the facts, that challenges their beliefs, that is something that might take them a little bit more to kind of realize, or one, they're probably going to question that more. And so how can we allow them to question and help them question, but also then not turn them off completely so they don't read the story? And so that's what we're trying to do with some of these tips that I shared. Here's an example of just a couple examples that I want to share before I take some questions here. This is an example of basically addressing some of these criticisms head on. I'm not sure how often some of your newsrooms are doing that. If you get accusations of fake news, of not telling the truth, of, spreading misinformation, or, being biased, one of the best things you can do is address that directly. And there are multiple different ways that you can do that. Ideally, you're addressing some of this before the questions come in and not after the fact. But if it is after the fact, we find it still can be effective. You just want to make sure that wherever you're addressing it, that somehow is attached to the story, ideally. And ideally that you're doing this publicly. I know a lot of times people say, oh, well, I responded via email, I took this phone call. That is all really, really great. But then we're only reaching one or two people, and those are probably not the only people that have those questions. And so anything you can do to address these accusations can be really powerful. And the best way to do that is to take the accusation or criticism, and sometimes it's not going to come to you as a question, and instead it's going to come as a criticism or a statement. So how can you turn that criticism into a question that you can answer about how you did the work? And so this is an example. Did you check the Democrats? Why do you fact check Republicans more? And basically what they explain is that, yes, first we did fact check the Democrats. Here are the links. And also, if there's something that we haven't fact checked and you think we should, please let us know. So you're asking for that feedback, right? But also, this is really, really interesting response, because they then get into details about why they choose what to fact check. And they say that, we do tend to fact check provocative statements that sound wrong. So if some people get fact checked more, that may be why. And I think that's really interesting, because it is getting at the heart of, like, provocative statements, if someone is making a lot of provocative statements, that could be why they are fact checked more, because that's something that we do tend to do. So someone may just think, oh, you don't like that politician, that's why you're fact checking them more. And it's like, well, no, actually we're doing it because they say a lot of things that are provocative or that are left unchecked, or that don't have data to back it up. And so that's why we are doing the fact check. This is another example of doing that same thing, basically this accusation of publishing more negative stories about President Trump compared to President Obama or compared to President Biden. And this was just an example that they got, very specific about why they, it seems like, and there probably is a more critical stories about President Trump compared to President Obama. And they talk about why that is. And that's because of different things that President Trump has done or is involved in. This is an example about how to respond to misinformation accusations. And again, it's about getting on the record. And so there were accusations that the news organization here basically edited photos to make it look like there was a different person holding a different flag. And they basically said, no, here's exactly how it happened. Here's our video, here's a step-by-step of what it is. And it just so happened that there are actually two people that were there with these different flags. And that's why there was that confusion. But explaining that and making sure these explanations get added to social, get added to the original content. And so I want to share this because this is important, because it's related to COVID, but the Coloradoan has done a really, really good job of making sure that their Facebook pages and their Facebook comments and comments on their website, they're very, very specific about what they will allow and what they won't. And they say, in this case, they were saying we will be removing posts that are purely speculation regarding coronavirus. They have said the same thing about the election. They get on the record about this and say, anything unconfirmed, that is not a place for this. You can message us with questions, but please don't post anything unconfirmed here, because we want this to be a space for accurate, reliable information that has been confirmed. But if you have questions, send us a private message. And since they have been doing that, actually, they've been able to have just less trolling and kind of better conversations around the facts. And when they started enforcing it, they haven't had as many people doing it after they realized, oh, wow, they actually are going to delete these posts and they are going to remove people from the group or block them from the page. And so I'm going to stop there and see if there are any questions, but I have a lot of other examples that I can share from various newsrooms we've worked with, and also some of our research that we know about explain your process boxes and how some of this works. So are there any questions? Let's see.
I think I heard right after work.
Yes,
Joe?
I have a question. Just earlier, we were talking about highlighting what you call moderate voices. And I'm sure you get this question a lot when talking to these kind of groups. And I'm immediately, that word strikes me and I recoil, because to me, that sounds, I immediately think well, what's the moderate position or voice on treating people with dignity? Or, what's the moderate position on whether torture is okay? You know what I mean? Things like that, and anti-racism and things of that nature. And do you essentially have to pick a point when you say that people who are mad about this can go, fuck themselves about things that are basic human dignity, or how do you address that? And what the moderate aspect of that? I feel like that would drag you further to the right as the Overton window shifts.
Yeah, no, I thank you for saying that, because that's a really, really good question. And this is something that I think that a lot of people do ask about. And I want to say, first of all, at Trusting News, we are definitely not saying cater to the audience and to their views. That is not at all what we are saying. We still think it is very, very important to stick to focus on the facts, be as accurate as possible, be as ethical as possible, all of that, and responsible as possible. But what we mean by that is, one thing you can do, and some newsrooms are doing this kind of in different ways and are more comfortable doing that. When it comes to calling people who say that people who say that Trump won the election, saying that that's a lie, right? What is your stance on that? Are you going to call it a lie? What is the term you're using? And for us at Trusting News, we don't really take a position on what you should be using, but what we do say is, how are you explaining the term to your audience? So it's really, really important with the terms that you are using to explain why you are using or calling it the lie, or why you are highlighting people who are saying that President Trump still won, right? So that transparency around that's really important, and that transparency should be almost every time it's used. I know it sounds like that'll get repetitive, but it won't, because people aren't consuming our content as much as we want. Now, when it comes to sort of these bigger issues that you're talking about, some newsrooms have also said, look, like climate change, we have newsrooms that have taken some, pretty, I guess, more liberal stances on this than others. And they have said, we believe that climate change is real. Our goal is to contribute and produce stories that are going to help solve the problem. So get on the record about that. And if that is what you are going to do, stick with that. Just make sure that in stories that's clear that that is your approach. So that if someone's like, oh, you didn't talk to the other side, we'll say, no, that we're not going to talk to the other side in that case, right? And we think that's totally okay. The key is be transparent about it, so people know the goals ahead of time or up front.
Like no buzz, avoid. I actually hate the term "the big lie." I think it's corny as hell, and I think it does exactly what you're saying. It does. It caters and signals to certain groups that, well, we know what the. I agree that I think plain language, avoiding buzzwords and everything makes sense, and then also choosing factual voices as opposed to moderate, or maybe not as opposed to, or maybe that's what you meant, as opposed to partisan or more emotive types of voices. Although I would also just add that I do think that there are still places where passionate voices about something that is factual is relevant, even if it does upset people who refuse to acknowledge the dignity and value of humanity in certain cases.
Yeah, and so just kind of building on that, I think what's important is, like, there are ways to talk about. One, I think it's important that people understand, that people believe that. I was working with RFERL and with their Central Asian newsrooms, and their newsroom in Iran was saying, they get calls from people who believe that women should be stoned. What do they do with those calls, right? That's not something they believe. That's something, they don't believe that at all. And so we had this conversation, and, I do think it's important that people still know that people feel that way, right? And so, because otherwise you're creating this bubble and people don't understand how others think. And so there's still a way to make sure that people feel this way. We believe that that is wrong, but we want to make sure that you do understand that exists. And so how are you having conversations about that? Yeah. Any other questions?
I think we did have one or two in the chat.
Okay.
Kevin Coughlin in particular.
Oh, yeah. How many people has the Coloradoan assigned to moderate comments? So generally it's one person. And so actually what she does is she kind of picks times to do it. So she's not there all the time, but she picks and she'll maybe check in 2 to 3 times a day. And she's like, okay, I'm going to limit it to 15 minutes. I'm going to limit it to 20 minutes. And she does as much as she can to either delete comments, repost their comment guidelines. But that's the approach that she has taken. And what's interesting is that the more that they have enforced those guidelines, the more that they have deleted comments and kind of reinforced that, she finds that she does not have to delete as much of that type of content because people understand it's going to be gone. Katrina, did you have a question? And I think you're muted still, but there you go.
Long time no see.
Yes, I know. Hello.
How do you deal with that? And people get upset, and maybe I don't want people to lose trust in news, but at the same time, I'm also thinking about people who have trans children or trans people themselves. what about their trust in our news to call out people who are just objectively hateful? Like, I'm not saying that because we're different and disagree. That's just what they do.
Yeah.
I just don't know how to, and I guess I'm also just curious in general, like, what about trusting news and initiatives to sort of, how do we get, because there's a lot of conversation right now about mainstream media, not being transphobic or, for example, or being sexist or racist or what have you. Like, I feel like sometimes when we talk about trusted news conversations, it always leans towards the white conservative and never towards any marginalized population.
Yeah. So with the one, I think it is really important to think about, like, if someone is saying something that is racist, that is transphobic, that is any of that, like, I think as a news organization, like, we shouldn't just blatantly publish because so-and-so said something, right? We have to be we should be thinking very carefully about that. I think everyone kind of, understands that there are obviously possible potential, like legal and all those kind of other obligations or potentials there too. But like, we do need to pause for a moment. And so then the question is, okay, how do you though make sure that people know that this person said these things, right? And so you can instead maybe describe or say that something they said during the meeting was transphobic. By that, we mean, that's the important thing, like, define what you mean by transphobic and why it is problematic, and try to point to not your definition, right? But definitions that exist, definitions from maybe local experts, right? So that it's outside of your scope, even if you may agree with that or, have your own definition, but that is kind of key. The other thing that I was going to share here that is sort of related to that, this is something we worked with WITF, and they were getting a lot of problems covering the school board, and it was about critical race theory, and literally every story they did, it was just like trolling in comments. Like, it was just wild. Like, no one was paying any attention to the journalism. Like, it was out of control. And so we had a call, and I said, have you ever explained critical race theory? And they said, well, yeah, we do in every story. And they sent me the example, and it's kind of how most news organizations do. It's like a sentence in the story, or it's a paragraph that's in paragraph 3, right? Or something. So I suggested a different approach, and this story actually got a lot better comments and a lot more engagement. And so there are two things that stand out about this that are different than other reporting. One, it's in like a Q&A format. So with some of these topics, we have found that one way to potentially sort of take emotion out of this and be able to still reach people who have differing views is to do it in a Q&A format. What is critical race theory? Is it being taught here? So, and you can imagine this with all sorts of different topics, right? The other thing that I really like that they did, and we worked carefully on this note, and there are different ways that you can do it, and I'll just put the text in here so you can see it, but I haven't like come up with a name for this yet, but I'm kind of calling it like a take a deep breath note. It's kind of recognizing, hey, we know that people may have strong or do have strong, opinions about this, right? And so even though we're still encouraging you to read this explainer, because it's designed to set out the facts, and we'd like to include more voices in our reporting. So it's kind of like let's pause for a moment and recognize this is something that people are upset about, that people may not want to read, that you may think that we're biased about, whatever it might be, right? But please pause. Let us tell you our promise and our goal with this coverage, and then also give you a place to get in touch with us to see if we can improve it. Does that help a little?
I think it helps me. I think I was just typing this in the chat, but I'll just say it. I'm curious how newsrooms might be able to go further and be more proactive and not allow themselves to be dragged into these debates, the context, the scope, and the definitions of which seem to always be set by these agitators, the particularly right-wing agitators and bigots who, and I know you said don't use bigots, but they're bigots, who seem to be able to set the terms of the debate before it's even started, so that by the time newsrooms are even having to get to this point, they're already on their back foot and they've already given up so much ground to just be having to say, no, it's not being taught in our schools, as if that's like a good thing. Like, no, we're not teaching kids how to, about the history of racial oppression and the systemic ways that it impacts us even today. Like, you know what I mean? It just already seems like we've given up or lost so much ground before we even get to that point. And it's sort of the perfect trap, because by not responding to it or not, refusing to engage at that level, it's easily turned and made, to seem like, oh, you don't have any good points, or the facts aren't on your side, yada, yada, yada. And I wonder if there have been discussions or examples that you could maybe elaborate on that would be more proactive instead of reactive in that sense.
Yes, so we love proactive and we encourage proactive. The catch there is that one of really the only real ways that we have found newsrooms can be proactive is if they understand and know who their audience is. So you cannot anticipate or sort of know what kinds of feelings people have about some of these subjects unless you've been talking to your audience, unless you've been moderating comments, unless you've been really just flat out asking them. And so something that we encourage newsrooms to do when we're kind of first starting with them is like, spend 15 minutes looking at your comments. What are you seeing? What kinds of trends are you seeing? What do people have questions about, right? What are people seeming to have a lot of criticism about? And then are there ways to, most of the time there are ways that normally it's based in them not understanding something. And so how can you talk more about your mission, your goals, and all of that? And so two things. One, it's you have to listen to your audience to anticipate that. And then two, it's how are you being transparent about what your goals are with covering this? Like, what is your goal with covering education? What is your approach when dealing with subjects that might be controversial? Like, how do you try to make sure that the full view of the community is represented? Like, what is that process? Can people easily get in touch with you to share what they want? Is it easy to get in touch with you? Are you constantly asking them for their feedback? And so ways you can do that are through surveys. We would highly recommend before you start covering something that, that you're going to spend a lot of time in, or you're planning on doing a deep dive, ask your community, like, where are your thoughts about this? What are things you don't know? What are things you've heard that you're confused about? And then that will give you a sense of, okay, wow, there's a lot of misinformation out here that we need to address first before they're ever going to understand this deep dive or this investigation. And how can you add context? Katrina, I just want to say, as far as a freelancer and not having say, I think that is really important. And so one thing you could try to do or ask for is, can you create like your own like reporter mission statement about what your goals are? And can you get that added to the bottom of a story? And maybe that links to something like on your website where you talk about what your approach is with this. I know that's a little extra work, but if you can just get them to add 2 or 3 lines at the bottom of a story that links to something that is like your code of ethics or your mission with some of this coverage, that might work.
We have about 15 minutes left in our allotted time. So make sure you get your questions in now before we get to the end, folks.
Yeah. If there aren't any other questions, I do want to share, I'll share a couple more examples here. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And so these are some examples. This is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. We've done a lot of work with them. And again, this just feeds into that transparency. They wanted to add a bunch of transparency around election coverage. And so they got on the record about how their agenda, they have an agenda. So that's something else. You're probably accused of having an agenda, and journalists instantly want to say, no, we don't. But actually we do. It's to serve the public. We may not call it that way. We may call it a mission, but it's okay to use the word agenda and say, yeah, our agenda it's to serve the public, or it's to serve this particular area of the state or the country, or we tackle these types of issues. I also think we should get more comfortable saying, like, we are on the side of facts. We are people who want to see the community succeed. That's why we cover the stories we do, right? So how can you talk about that and be on the record with that and have that published somewhere so you can easily share it? And so that's what they did when they talked about how the AJC covers the Georgia legislature. One thing I love is that they were being accused of covering Republican issues more. And they were like, well, we probably will cover Republican initiatives more. And that's because they're the ones that are in control right now, and their initiatives are more likely to get passed. Even adding that explanation is something that people are not connecting the dots on. And then they also talk about how they hold themselves accountable, and that their scrutiny is not based on personal political views. And so I think just getting on the record with that is important. Explaining your approach to polls. This is also, you know, an example of why they did a poll, who they partnered with, how it was done, how they're using it, and what the intention of the poll is. It's not to tell you who's going to win. It's to provide a snapshot of how people feel 1 year out. This is a page I particularly love. They're actually in the process of redoing it for their governor's race. And it's basically a whole page dedicated to how they are going to cover a particular race. They have their commitment. They talk about how they are going to cover it. They're going to attend forums, conduct deep background investigations, publish profiles of each candidate that will aim at understanding each candidate's personal life, background, influences, and qualifications. They have a photo of their journalist. And then they also they had a great addition to that page that literally explained, what does the mayor do? Again, that seems really silly, but often you have politicians who stand up and they make claims about what they're going to do when they're in this position. And it's like, well, they can't even actually do that. Like, that's not even possible. But if people don't know what a mayor can do or what the limitations are, how are they going to connect those dots? And so if you have that somewhere explaining, you can turn back to it and connect the dots to it. And then two more examples, then I'll see if there's the question in the chat. But they did a whole deep dive into the campaign to undermine Georgia's election. That's what they called it. They had an editor's note at the top. They also did an explainer about how the story was reported. What I really love about it is they kept tying it back to what they did. So they did interviews. They looked at investigative documents. They published news reports. They also said, you know, the story is not over. So you're going to continue to see some of this. Then they shared this information on Twitter. And one of the things they highlight in the story is, you know, we did this because we believe at the AJC, our job is to document the history of our state. It's also our job to shine a light on the actions of officials who work to change the outcome of a historic election. And so that's, you know, what they're kind of, again, that's not like kind of using, to me, that's using moderate language compared to maybe what you might see, and tying it to something that hopefully is a little more neutral, like documenting history. You're still holding people accountable, but when you're talking about it, you're saying, you know, the goal here is to document the history of the state. And then they also had a timeline of events that, again, it allows people to focus on the facts and information without some of that emotion that can be in there sometimes. And was there another question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kelly wants to know, should you respond to abusive emails from readers? For example, you are full of it, but more colorful.
Yes. Okay, so at Trusting News, we do believe that people are worth responding to. We also, though, know it's really, really important to, if it is someone who is being racist, sexist, yelling at you, all of that, you also have the ability, and you should say that, no, I'm not going to put up with this. I'm not going to kind of be treated this way. And that absolutely is okay as well. But if you can, after you get the email and you feel that you are in a place to do this, kind of step away, take a deep breath, kind of see, is there anything in that email that seems that there might be a place where I can explain my work to have them better understand it? If there isn't, you can just delete it, especially if it's someone you've heard from multiple times or it's someone you've talked to before and it's not working. You could just reply and say, you know, thank you for the feedback, something like that. But if there is an opportunity to kind of explain or add the explanation, we do recommend trying that the first time. If they then keep coming back and it's not working, then again, that's where we say, okay, give up. Not everyone is reachable. But it absolutely is okay to also say, I do not want to respond to that. You should, I know your newsrooms probably have different policies, and I'd make sure to, talk to someone about what those policies are, but you want to document any kind of abusive comments, take screenshots of them, make sure that you are saving them somewhere so that if it does continue to escalate or something else happens, that you have that available to hand over to the authorities if it reaches that level, a manager, anything like that. I hope that was helpful. Yeah, Kevin.
So, I mean, this is kind of an existential kind of a thing, but I've been watching the Ken Burns documentary on the U.S. and the Holocaust, and there were a lot of news stories written in the 30s. Americans knew what was going on with Hitler and his treatment of the Jews, and a big chunk of the United States just didn't care. And now we're in a situation where we have a demagogue that's leading us and threatening democracy in a major way, and a big chunk of America doesn't care. I bumped into a guy yesterday that was citing that documentary 2000 Mules as if it was gospel truth. And I've got someone running for a town council position who buys the whole Trump agenda, all the lies and everything. How do I deal with that? I mean, how do I cover this? When I'm covering that race, what am I supposed to say about this person? I mean, who thinks that Trump won an election, that Biden stole it, and believes the whole line? I mean, it's we're the last line of defense here. I mean, we have a Supreme Court that's highly partisan. We have one half of our political system that's been totally co-opted, and the press is it. So what are we to do?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. It's an important question, and I think I want to share something that WITF has done.
What is that?
WITF, sorry, yes, they are a radio newsroom in Pennsylvania, and so I'm putting 2 links there. And they have gone on the record about how they are going to basically, their commitment, which they have continued to do, is that any lawmaker locally there, right, in Pennsylvania, that believed or helped kind of push claims that President Trump won the election, they are making sure to remind their readers and their listeners of that in every story, even if it's something not related to this. So let me share my screen really quickly again. So they did this explainer saying what they are going to do. Then how this shows up in daily stories is they do a box here that you can see, and they're covering this lawmaker. And this is the state senator, I think state senator, I'm not sure, maybe a senator or a lawmaker, I'm not sure. Basically saying that, this is part of our commitment. We are continuing to point out lawmakers who tried to thwart the election, and he is one of them. And so every story about him, they include a note like this. In other stories about other lawmakers who do this, they include a note like this, reminding people. That is part of like their commitment to kind of constantly make sure that people are making that connection and are reminded of it. That is probably the most extreme approach I've seen a newsroom do, but they're consistent with it. They're on the record about it. They're transparent about it.
So just not to belabor this, but this particular council candidate was there on January 6th at the Capitol.
Yeah.
So, I mean, should I tack that onto the bottom of every story? I mean,
yeah, I mean, that's absolutely something you should do. I mean, I do feel like we have a responsibility to connect the dots for people. People are way too busy to do it themselves. People are not paying attention. People don't remember people's names. They're just not making these connections. You know what I mean? So how can we remind them of that? Now, if you're going to do that, I do think it's good to be transparent about that by maybe writing like a letter from the editor, like, we believe in protecting democracy. We believe in protecting elections and having secure elections. So you are going to see things like XYZ. If we know that someone was at the January 6th riot, we are going to include that in the story so that you are reminded of that. We feel like that's important. We are calling it a riot, right? Even talking about that. You can also, when they make a claim, if you're going to publish what they say we know that this is not true, and link to information saying why this is not true. And again, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and so my inclination would be to link to a source like the New York Times or the Washington Post, which does their homework, et cetera. But the other side, oh no, they're the liberal media. You know?
Yeah, so I would recommend, can you create that content yourself? Like, do you like, and like, do you have a page somewhere like saying why you believe, or that, like, is there a way to explain that as the local information source instead of linking to the New York Times or the Washington Post?
But I mean, you have to have facts, you know,
Yeah.
to base the fact that we know that the election was not stolen because XYZ, XYZ. And these things have all been well documented by reputable news sources.
Could you instead point to a register of voters accounts and like final counts there? And again, I know that's not always also trusted, but that might be better because it's sort of a little bit removed from what people's instant potential belief of the Washington Post or New York Times is.
Yeah, I was going to say, even, I mean, in some situations, there are little video clips and audio clips that of people saying certain statements that you can point to prove that they're being untruthful or whatever. But yeah, creating that stuff, or even a repository of it on your own website, citing original or you know, first order source materials that. Because yeah, I've seen that a million times. You cite the New York Times, the eyes roll back. I mean, even that happens to me because the New York Times has I have my own issues with the New York Times. I was going to say I would really love to see that kind of disclosure, or what Marion called the disclaimer statements before things, like when George W. Bush gets up to speak. It's a pop-up that says, you know, George W. Bush orchestrated a global misinformation campaign to lie us into an illegal war with Iraq. Like, you got to basically, you have to gauge that and tailor it to that particular situation and individual, I would say.
Joe, do you know of an entity that has put together such a reputable
PolitiFact.
that we could?
I was thinking PolitiFact maybe potentially. That might be a little more neutral than, I think personally, from what I know from news consumers, I think it probably would be more neutral. I'd have to do some searching to find exactly kind of which ones to point you to. Oh, ProPublica, Joe is putting in there, would be a good one, I think, as well. That just, they're just a little, they're less polarizing than when people hear Washington Post or New York Times.
And you mentioned agendas and how people, you know, guess what your agenda is. You know, my inclination would be, in like political debates coming up in my area, to ask the Republican, so who won the election? And I know that from that side, they're going to say, oh, you've got a bias. But I think that's a perfectly valid question in this age. Yes,
yeah,
no?
and you can, yeah, no, and I think you can say that you do have a bias, right? You could say you have a bias toward facts. We don't use that language because we are sort of afraid to, I think, say it that way. But at the end of the day, we do have a bias toward facts. If you look at, I think we can all agree with that. And so you can say that. And that's basically what, in that first link I shared, WITF, that's what they say. They are saying, you know, they are committed to protecting democracy, and that is where their bias stands. And that is how the coverage will be presented.
Will you share some of these with us later that we can?
Yeah, I will. So I'm not sure who the best is to send it to, but I can share. Okay, I will send it to Joe. And all the links for the examples are in the presentation. And then there are a lot more as well. And if there's something that you don't see represented, that you're wondering if someone has done, please, I'll put my email in here again. Send me an email, and I am glad to try to see if we have one. We also have tons of examples on our website as well, which is just trustingnews.org.
Yeah, I'm going to send out, just like all of our trainings, I'm going to send out the link to the recording of this training, the auto-generated transcript, Lynn's contact information, info about Trusting News, any links and slides that she sent over, and an option for you to listen to the audio-only version of this.
And then I also would just offer, like, if this is something that anyone's particularly dealing with, and you want sort of help, like kind of guidance, and want to connect 20 minutes or something, we are glad to do that as well. send me an email and we can schedule that and kind of make suggestions on even draft language if that's helpful, like what it could say, where it could go, because we've dealt with a lot of newsrooms as far as placement. When does it make sense for it to go at the top, at the bottom, within the story, kind of pulling it out in a shaded box, and we have some research around that.
I'm just thinking, I don't know, Joe, maybe it would be helpful if, like, in our news commons, we could agree to a set of principles and some boilerplate that we can use. I mean,
I would love that.
I could spend so much of my time, which is very limited as a one-man band here, trying to prove the sky is blue, which we all know, you know what I mean? They can drag you down the rabbit hole. So if we have some stuff we agree upon.
I think that's a great idea. I think I definitely support that. I also think that at a certain level, especially for a hyper-local organization like Morristown Green, there is just that element of personal local connection that coming from you and having your voice is going to go so much further than bringing in any white labeled stuff, which obviously we can help white label it for you in different organizations. And I agree, and we should do that. But at a certain point, I think really it comes down to, you know, picking the battles that you can win and doing it from a perspective of genuine authenticity as someone who lives in and is among the community that you're reporting on. And you really just can't beat that. There's nothing that can supplant that when it comes down to it. We are over time though, and I could continue this conversation forever. Want to be respectful of both Lynn and everyone else on this call's time. So thank you all for joining. I will send the recording and a summary email as soon as this is done processing on Zoom. And again, thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much. Thank you, Trusting News. We'd love to have you back though for more of this in the future, and give our best to Joy and tell her we're sending positive energy towards her.
Yes, I will. Thank you so much. Please reach out. I just put one more link in there just that I found quickly, like how the NPR uses and why they rely on the Associated Press and all of that for election results. So that's, a lot of newsrooms have done that, and that's something that you can do as you're talking about some of this. So
thank you. Bye,
thanks,
everybody.
everyone. Bye.